Hi class, how have you been? Hope you have been doing well. Now, during our last lesson, we went through the definition of the terms that are used in foundations of physical education and sports. And therefore, today we are going to look at the history and development of sports and physical education in ancient societies. Now, the question here is, why do we study foundations of physical education and sport? Is it of any relevance to the society? Now, these foundations provide information of nature, concept, and objective of physical education. So it gives us a background where physical education came from, and therefore it gives us an enlightenment of reason why we must be able to take part in it. It also identified the influences of various philosophies of physical education. It traces historical development of physical education, like what you're going to look at the development of physical education in ancient societies. And also, it tries to identify philosophy, psychology, sociological theories that are applicable in physical education. Then we try to apply this theory and principles in teaching physical education. For instance, in teaching physical education, theories in psychology are very vital so that you can be able to handle your students. And then we can also be able to try to relate these theories and principles in our teaching. Now, foundations of physical education, like I said during our first lesson, is that it encompasses three. We have the history, psychology, philosophy, and sociology. Now, keenly today, we are going to look at the foundations in ancient societies. In this case, we are going to look at the first country, which is China. We'll look at the Greece, we're going to look at Egypt, and lastly, we're going to look at the Roman. Now, physical education, that is the way we know it today, never used to exist like that in the previous days. Now, it existed, yes, but there were no programs that were done. There was no program of having a lesson like we have it today. There's nobody who sat down to come up with the skills to be followed sequentially. So it was being participated by most of the people as they do their role, their work every day. They took part in physical education as they did activities like erecting shelters, doing activities for survival. For instance, if maybe you met a wild animal, you'd run to save your life. You would swim, if maybe a crocodile was running after you. All these are physical activities that are today organized, but in those days they were there just for survival. Now, participation in physical education was practical. Yes, it was practical just as it is today. To develop, they wanted to develop their agile bodies, strong bodies, powerful, oblivious to demand of the primitive life. So the life demanded them to be very strong. The young boys were supposed to be very strong so that they can be able to do these physical activities. They had to go and hunt and gather in the forest, and therefore they required to be strong, to have a whole day in the forest to gather. Now, some of the mimic games offered children opportunity to prepare themselves for adult life. So most of them, because they were doing activity, mimicking or rather looking at the way their parents were doing. And also the right practices were common, like for instance, things like saying like looking for food, erecting shelters, and also defensive practices. Now in China itself as a country followed a policy of isolation, being isolated from the rest of the world. And therefore, being isolated from the rest of the world, they were not able to mingle with the rest of the world. So the activities they did, what they knew, they could not buy from other parts of the world. So sports in China, therefore, they claim a history as long as the honorables of the country civilization. We know that country called China is one of the countries that we can be able to trace back its civilization. And therefore, as we try to trace back the civilization of this country, we trace back the sport. It was not left behind. So, as China grew in economic and political, and also in the military development, sport was being practiced. Now, sport in ancient China were extremely rich and very diversified. They had varied activities that they took part in. Now, like I said, that this country were being done, most of the activities they were doing them for survival. They were confined in the military places where they could be able to train. Most men were involved in activities to train them physically to gain the fitness so that they can take part in the military activities. They played swans play activities, things like wrestling, archery, and if you look at most of these games, they were to prepare them for fighting. Now, the games like Kung Fu was developed to prevent diseases, so everybody was supposed to go for this particular game. Kung Fu is a game that is similar to the mature games that we have, like the karate, the judo, and others. Now, Suju, as we refer it, is the current football. Now, if you look historically, the history of football that is playing today, it started in China. And this game they called it Suju. This particular game was very important. It was played during important days, like when the celebrations of the emperors. So, when the people who won this game, they were treated to big feasts, and the ones who lost, they were flogged. Now, a variety of activities were participated and they were practiced. Now, they did entertainment, sports like the swanman, Suju, keep fitting activities like physical breathing, exercises. They also did military sports. Now, China, like I said, was being isolated from the rest of the world. Therefore, the development was also hindered. So the growth was not the way it was. Some of the reasons that caused the growth was like the bit of being sheltered by the Himalaya mountains and the Great Wall. We know the history about the Great Wall of China. So it hindered them to reach out to the rest of the world. Then another thing was that China didn't have a permanent government. It was being ruled by what you call the military lords, and each lord was controlling a province. So each one of them wanted to assert authority over the others. And therefore, as a result of that, there was a lot of dispute between these particular military lords. So that brought a lot of dispute, and therefore, the growth of sports was compromised. Another thing that hindered development of sports in China was the taxation. For you to take part in physical education or sport, you had to pay tax. So that means that people came from backgrounds that were not able, they could not take part in physical activities. So it's only kids who came from the families that were rich who were able to take part in them. So they were the ones who had the privilege of taking part in these particular games. Now you can see some of the activities that were done by the Chinese people, things like the Chinese golf, we call it Chuiwani. Polo. Polo is a game that was almost very similar to hockey, but they were playing it when they were on top of the horses using very long sticks, and they were chasing a ball that was wooden. We have other activities like the ancient football, like Suju, the ice skating, the archery, and the others. Now, we have Egypt is another ancient country, or rather that was very keen about the participation in sports. Egypt was a military state, and therefore, the only way of survival was through fighting. So to them, physical activities were vital to be able to come up with strong men who could be able to go and fight for their countries. So therefore, physical education became very prominent in that country. Now, princes were encouraged. They encouraged to exercise regularly, because even the princes themselves, they were supposed to take part during the military, when they are going out, they were supposed to be able to go to call them off, and therefore they were supposed to take part. Therefore, they were supposed to be very fit. So therefore, we find that the king or the princes were very fit. They were supposed to engage. The aim was to increase the chance of group survival. That was the purpose of most of this particular participation in the sports, because they required people who were very strong. Then, they were able to come up with people who were very agile. They were able to come up with people who were very strong, to be able to withstand the danger of the outdoor life, because most of them were doing outside to go and fight for their country. So they went to be physically fit to be able to do that. Many of today's sports were practiced in the ancient Egypt. If you look at most of the games that are done today as in the modern world, these games were done in Egypt. So most of the rules therefore were set in Egypt. So as far as we are talking about China taking part in most of the games, we find that Egypt was very keen as far as the regulation of the rules is concerned. Now, The young ones learned through apprenticeship. That is where they learned by looking at what their parents were doing. Now, the king, the princes, statesmen attended sport competitions. So everybody, if the king, the princesses were to attend, whom were they not to be part of it? Then we can be able to tell which games took part in Egypt by looking at the inscriptions on the monuments. Things you find, look on the monuments in Egypt. If you visit, you find that these monuments, there are people wrestling, others are doing weightlifting, others are doing jumps, others are slinging, so there are games that were played. So it tells you that. A very good example is the Palau monument. It gives an evidence of several thousand years ago where Egypt had laid down the rules of the games. It is states up to today. Now, we go from Egypt, we go to Greece. Greece, the ancient Greece believed in physical perfection. And this one affected their lifestyle. It became very key to them. Now, physical education was vital part of the education in every Greek boy. Why are you talking about the boy? In Greece, women were not taking part in sports, mostly. So it was games, sports were for women, and women were supposed to be able to they were just like ornamental. Physical education was therefore a unifying factor to the Greeks. It brought them together. Physical education promoted, encouraged discipline, physical well-being, and also their aesthetic values. Now, Greek sport manifested itself to beyond the amateur, what we call the Pan-Hellenic festival that was held every year. Now, Greek is a country that originated the Olympic Games that we have today. It started in Greece. And these games were taking part every year, and that's what you're calling the Pan-Hellenic Games. Now, physical education and sport in Greeks were taking part in two areas, the Spartans and the Athenians. Now, when you come to the Spartans, their approach to physical training was strictly for the military. They were training them so that they can be able to take part in the military activities. So a Spartan boy, once they were born, at 7 years, they were supposed to be housed in a primitive barracks. And the reason why they had to go to the barracks at 7 years to be trained, how to be able to acquire the skills and the strength so that they can be able to become good fighters. So they participated in activities like the horsemanship, the archery, discus throwing, javelin throwing, field events, and like. When they attained 20 years, they took an oath. And when they took an oath, then they were supposed to now involve themselves in the military welfare or rather warfare. A well-educated Spartan was one who was physically fit and good soldier. So the way we regard physical the education today is we look at the cognitive part in our world. During then, in Greeks, more specific in Spartans, they were looking at how good were you in your physical fitness and also how good soldier were you. So the ones who participated in festivals organized by Athens, they competed in boxing. As much as you're saying Athens are the ones who organized these Pan-Hellenic games, the Spartans went to take part in these particular games. They were also Greeks. In Athens, physical education and athletic competition was very prominent. Now, actually, these are the people who started the Olympic Games. The sport was associated with philosophy, music, literature, paintings, and also the sculptures. Now, at 6 years, an Athenian boy was starting their schooling, where they were supposed to be able to do common activities like wrestling, gymnastics, physical, and intellectual growth. Now, when some of the Greek philosophers encouraged these things like people like the Plato, the Aristotle, the Herodotus, they took part in this particular, they came to view these activities, and that shown that they really, they encouraged the Greeks to be able to take part in this particular activity, and they really supported physical activity. Now, Greeks, and mostly the Athenians, they constructed 3 gymnasia that were very vital to take part in these activities, as we can see them, and each one of them was dedicated to a certain god like we have. Now, Athens, the Greeks were the ones who took part in the Olympic Games. They're the ones who began the Olympic Games that we have today. However, there was a break between the ancient Olympic Games and the today's, what you call the modern Olympic Games. After the emperor was ruling that particular time, felt that the games had lost the meaning. Some of the reasons that hindered this particular development were things like he felt that people started glorifying the participants. And these particular activities were meant to be for the glory of Zeus, the god. Most of them, when the Romans conquered Greeks, the Romans normally altered the development of sport in Greece because they never understood the meaning of these particular games. And therefore, this one being that saw the closure of these particular games. So the emperor was ruling during that particular time, felt that because these games have lost their spiritual meaning, therefore, he ordered for the closure. Until later, in 18th century, when a certain French soldier, scholar felt like the world had become a brutal place to live, and therefore he looked for means of uniting the people of the world, and he felt like sports was the best way to be able to unite the people. And that's called now the development of the modern Olympic Games. Now we go to the history and development of sports in Rome. This is our last state. Rome itself, the physical education to the Romans were meant for here the military. If you look at it, either in China, Greeks, or even Egypt, most of them were doing it for military. That means, that tells you the sports mostly were for survival. Romans youth required physical skills for induction to manhood and also for military. So for you to be inducted to be called a man, you went to take part in sports. And that's why acquisition of physical fitness was vital. Romans conquered Greece, and this one, when they conquered Greece stopped being the world power and Romans took over. So they got the influence from the Greek culture. Greeks were a rich culture in sports, and therefore this influenced the Romans. Now they participated in activities like running, swimming, wrestling, horsemanship, fencing, archery, and the others. Chariot racing were some of them, and the gladiatorial shows were held in large sporting events. These were, they fought against wild animals or against other men until they kill. The Romans' games were big occasions. They pained the emperor with gladiatorial fights, and therefore they were extremely violent during these particular gladiatorial shows. So for them to be able to kill either the other fighter or to kill the wild animal, they had to be very violent. So the competitions were called adratai, and they trained full-time professionals in sports. Therefore, they were celebrated during important days, and therefore they enjoyed that particular privilege. Now, the question we should ask ourselves, did women participate in sports like men? Either in China, in Roman, or even in Egypt? Ancient Romans never offered equal privileges to women. They were not given that power to take part in the games. They trusted them in the housework. They also entrusted to have fashion. And that's why even up to today, the Romans women are still being fashionable. Then we have the development of physical education in Rome that were aided by two eras. Now, we had two eras that followed the growth, and they affected the growth of sports in Rome. The first one was called the asceticism, and that's when most of the Romans, and this also affected the Greeks, they started practicing the Catholic faith. So most of them, the religion became a big factor as compared to sports. Therefore, there was a lot of religion or other religious growth as opposed to sports. Now, when this particular asceticism period was over, like I said, that the second era that followed asceticism is the scholasticism, and this is where most of the Romans started going to school, and they started looking at this education being of great use to them. Now, most of the schools were attached to the monasteries, and these monasteries never supported physical education, and therefore physical education was not part of their curriculum. So therefore, there was no way we could have the growth of physical education in Rome during that particular time. Now, to conclude is that we can say that in ancient societies, and the societies we have paid attention to is the China, there is Egypt, there is Greece, and there is Rome. We can say that physical education and sports had no organized programs. They were there, they took part in the activities yet, but they were not organized. Then most of the physical activities participated as people carried out their daily duties. So there was no time we said that we are going to take part in the physical activities. They were doing their normal work. Like they went to hunt and gather in the forest to get food. They went to erect shelter. These were physical activities. They were crossing the rivers as they went to be able to take part in their normal duties. And they swam. So these are physical activities they were taking part in. Now, some of the Oriental names played games today similar to today's games. Now, some of the games that were played during the Oriental games, the Oriental time, it's similar to what we have even today. For instance, China, Greece, Romans, countries from Near East, they played games similar to what we have today. That's why we are saying that most of the games that are being played today, they tend to have originated from these particular countries. However, they cannot boast to be the only countries that played games. The others did. It's only that we regard them to have played games similar to what is done today. The ancient Olympic Games in Greece gave rise to the modern Olympic Games that we have today. So the rising of ancient Olympic Games in Greece that started as just the natural festival gave rise to the games that we have today that we call the Olympic Games, which is the biggest games event in the world, rather biggest sports. Exercise for you. First, how do you compare development of physical education in sports in China with Greece? Looking at China and looking at Greece as the two nations that regarded to have done games that were similar, how can you compare the two? Number two, outline the development of sports and physical education in the foreign ancient nations. Now, these are countries that came from the Far East. These places like Syria, Palestine, Babylon, the Persia, which are very much close later to Egypt. These were military states. Now, question is, how was the development of sport in these particular countries? So try to find out how the games started and how they originated from this particular part of the world. Thank you so much. In our next lesson, we are going to look at the ancient Olympic Games, the way it developed, and the moral teaching attached to these particular games as far as the Greek people were concerned. Thank you.
These televised lectures supplement our robust online learning going on our MKU online platform. You can view more on our televised lectures via our online platform. We are in a digital era, and Mount Kenya University knows this. The following are the steps to follow so as to complete your online application. Download the application form from the website www.mku.ac.ke. Attach copies of your academic certificates and ID. Pay the application fees via M-Pesa pay bill number 270988. Your ID is the account number. 2,000 shillings is the charge for a postgraduate. You can also deposit in the bank accounts provided on the website. Then email all the above to apply@mku.ac.ke.